I literally said to him, look, I'm willing to risk anything, even death, to be cured of this disease. I just don't want to be infertile. And his response was like, well, looking at your medical complications, you're probably already infertile and just didn't know it. And that was like a gut punch, because I had grown up going to sickle cell conventions and conferences, and I was seeing my doctor regularly, but nobody ever set me down to explain a potential correlation between sickle cell and infertility.
That is Teonna Woolford. She was born with sickle cell anemia, a genetic blood disorder that causes red blood cells to become crescent or sickle-shaped. Common symptoms include anemia, pain, fatigue, jaundice, and many others. But as you just heard, fertility is significantly impacted as well. Today, we're going to hear Teonna's story, how sickle cell has impacted her life, and how she's helping others through her 501c3 nonprofit called SC Red. I'm Dan Bulger with Progyny, and this is Infertility.
Sickle cell disease is a genetic condition that affects the red blood cells. In someone who does not have sickle cell, all of their cells are round and soft. But with sickle cell, you have cells that are sticky and sickle-shaped, or like crescent, half-moon shaped. And what happens is those cells get stuck in the blood vessels, and it makes it hard for oxygen to flow through the body easily. So basically anywhere that there's blood flow, which is everywhere, there can be complications. Anything ranging from stroke, organ damage, a lot of just painful episodes. And a lot of times people also don't consider the fact that your reproductive organs need blood to function properly. When I hit puberty, things started spiraling out of control because of hormone fluctuations. So I started having frequent hospitalizations. I was hospitalized at least once a month, if not every 2 weeks. And I was going to a really exclusive, expensive private school where they were unapologetic about the fact that they didn't know anything about sickle cell. And they would make comments like, oh, it'd just be so much easier if you had cancer, because if you had cancer, we could plan around your treatments. But with sickle cell, it's unpredictable and we don't know how to help you. So not only am I getting sick and feeling isolated from my peers because I'm missing so much time from school, I'm also having to shoulder the burden of like educating and advocating for myself with the administration. By the time I was 15, I had had both of my hips replaced. I was on transfusions, which one I had a really severe reaction to that actually sent me into liver failure. By the time I graduated high school, I was just tired and I felt like I just wasn't living the quality of life that I wanted to live. I was watching all of my friends go off to college and I couldn't do that because my body was just constantly failing me. At 18, I was still like hospitalized at least once a month, like I said, if not every 2 weeks. So I got approached. I was still seeing my pediatric team. And they said like, hey, I think you really need to consider a bone marrow transplant. Bone marrow transplants at the time was like the only known cure for sickle cell, but it's not universal or just easily accessible because you need a donor. So after a year of being on the registry, I gave up the dream of being cured with sickle cell and just thought I'd live with it. But it was really interesting because my mom, she was practicing bedside nursing, but she had just transitioned into teaching. So it's actually one of her students who approached her and they were like, hey, I know you mentioned your daughter has sickle cell and you guys were considering a bone marrow transplant, but she didn't have a donor. So I don't know if you know that there's this research being done where you no longer need a perfect match, you just need a half match. So you could potentially be your donor because parents are automatically at least a half match. We actually took the information back to my pediatric hematology team and they were like, yeah, we don't think that's a good idea. It's too new. It's too risky. We're worried about rejection, death, graft versus host disease. We just don't think it's a good idea. But there was One doctor, I was being treated by four, and one of them, the one that I respected the most, he was like, "Well, I think we need to consider it because you're running out of options. So let's just at least go to a consultation and get the information." So, I considered myself to be pretty informed. So I had done enough research to know that the bone marrow transplant would require chemotherapy and radiation. And I knew that those things could make you infertile. So I'm 19 at the time, and I go for my consultation, and I let the doctor say his little spiel. And I literally said to him, "Look, I'm willing to risk anything, even death, to be cured of this disease. I just don't want to be infertile." And his response was like, "Well, looking at your medical complications, you're probably already infertile and just didn't know it." And that was like a gut punch because I had grown up going to sickle cell conventions and conferences, and I was seeing my doctor regularly, but nobody ever set me down to explain a potential correlation between sickle cell and infertility. The doctor said, that I should really just focus on surviving and worry about children later. You can always adopt. So I remember going home and doing a Google search, looking just basically for education because I really didn't know anything about fertility preservation. But then when I came to the cost, I started looking into financial resources because I was on Medicaid. I knew they wouldn't cover it, and I wasn't working, so I knew I couldn't afford it. And basically what I saw was like a long list of foundations that would give away grants for fertility preservation if you had a diagnosis of cancer. So I remember calling a couple of those foundations and saying like, "Hey, I know I don't have cancer, but I'm getting chemotherapy and radiation, so maybe we can make an exception, kind of squeeze me in." And that didn't work. So at the time, it ended up being a finance thing. I just could not afford it. It wasn't accessible to me. It was really incredibly painful to realize that fertility preservation was out of my reach. So literally, the doctor told me that if I kept going the way I was going, I was probably going to die. So I reconciled, like, maybe it's a fair trade-off. I can give up the dream of biological children if it means, surviving, and I can just adopt. But unfortunately, I ended up rejecting the bone marrow transplant. So I went through everything, the chemo, the radiation, lost my hair, had mouth sores. I was in the hospital for about 40 days during the process. And then I had to stay in an apartment that was 5 miles away from the hospital because obviously my immune system was depleted. So they want you to be able to get to the hospital just in case you get an infection or anything. They want you to be able to get there quickly. So I stayed in that apartment for what was supposed to be, I think, 4 months. But about 3 months in, I experienced like an incredibly high fever that just would not break. And all my blood counts just started plummeting. I wasn't producing any red cells, white cells, nothing. My bone marrow had just completely shut down. And what I ended up finding out was that I rejected the transplant. But not only did I reject my mom's cells, my own bone marrow was supposed to rev back up once I rejected, and it didn't. So I stayed in the hospital for about 4 months.
It's safe to say that Teonna has been through a lot. Well, I mean, more than that, really. And if you're keeping up with news around sickle cell, you might know that some recent developments have led to some pretty great new treatment options for those with sickle cell. Really revolutionary and groundbreaking stuff. But unfortunately, because of her failed marrow transplant, Teonna is not eligible. Obviously, this is heartbreaking stuff. But she's focusing her personal struggle into work that will really make a difference for others. Work she's doing through her organization, the Sickle Cell Reproductive Health Education Directive, or SC-RED.
Yeah, so SC-RED was really inspired largely because of my journey, but not only because of my story. So basically, just the lack of access to fertility preservation really disturbed me. I had my transplant like 12 years ago. And what happened was I started seeing a new hematologist when I was about 25 years old. And I didn't know at the time that hematologist was one of probably the only one studying ovarian reserve and sickle cell. So I set out to just start a foundation that would give away grants for people who wanted to pursue fertility preservation and IVF. But then in having conversations with that hematologist, Dr. Lydia Pecker, who is now one of my co-founders, she's like, it's great to have grants, but that's just kind of putting a Band-Aid on it. Like, we need to change policy. We need to get Medicaid to be able to cover this for our population. So we kind of added this advocacy piece. And then in having conversations with another one of my mentors, Dr. Kim Smith-Whitley, we realized that it would be irresponsible to just start an organization around fertility because there's so many other reproductive health implications for individuals with sickle cell disease, like hormone fluctuations that bring on pain, or having sex that can lead to a crisis, or the lack of access to care for pregnant women with sickle cell disease. And even the guys, they have their own reproductive health concerns. So we decided that we should start an organization for this incredibly unmet need. And we are the first and only sickle cell organization in the entire world to have a mission around reproductive and maternal health.
So it's not just grants. The mission of SC Red is real transformation.
So the mission of SC Red is to advocate for high quality reproductive and maternal health care for individuals with sickle cell disease. And we just envision a world where we have policies, resources, education, and support tailored to individuals with sickle cell disease. I think for so long, we've had to prioritize survival over quality of life, and then education and awareness, but we have not done enough to address what it means to really thrive with this disease. And for a lot of us, that means having a healthy sex life, having children, having safe pregnancies. And so that's what we're trying to do, just kind of address these inequities and disparities. We have a lot of educational resources. If you go on our website, it's heavily focused. I mean, that's what we are. We're Education Directive. So we host bi-monthly webinars. We have come up with fact sheets for every stage of pregnancy. So preconception, prenatal, pregnancy, and postpartum. And we did that in collaboration with the CDC and the American Society of Hematology. And I also have a preconception and pregnancy course.
If you or someone you know is interested in these resources, or you just want to donate, you can learn more at sicklecellred.org.
Sickle cell, I just want them to feel empowered to be their own advocate. You don't have to tolerate disrespect. You can always find a healthcare team who values you and values shared decision making. And just on a personal side, I know that it gets hard. Like, there's a lot of battles that we have to fight, but I really encourage anyone with sickle cell to find your purpose and find your passion, because that's what I'm doing. And it's really changed my life to be running this organization.
I want to thank Teonna for sharing her story with us and for all of the amazing work that she's doing for the sickle cell community. And I want to thank you for listening. If you'd like to connect with us, you can do so on Instagram at This Is Infertility Podcast. And if you'd like to connect with Progyny, that's at Progyny Inc. This Is Infertility is brought to you by Progyny. Please remember this podcast is not intended to substitute for the personalized expert advice of your physician. I'm Dan Bulger, and this is Infertility.